Hello, everybody. Welcome to week 9. The lecture this week is going to be looking at basically the height of European control of the globe. We're going to be looking this week at the rise of the great imperial forces on the European continent as they spread out into the globe. Over the last couple of weeks, we've looked at the way that Europe lost control of the Western Hemisphere, and we've looked and seen the upheavals that have led to a much more combative European continent than before. So this week we'll be looking at how those forces of nationalism and industrialization lead to the push for empire. The first part is going to be looking at the origins and the reasons for imperialism, and then looking at the rush for Africa and the carving up of the African continent. The second part will be looking at the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim states there, and how the Ottoman Empire's downfall is sort of precipitated by European forces gaining a lot more power. And then the third part will be looking at India and Southeast Asia. So we'll be moving eastward, and the next time we'll begin to look at China and the rise of a new Japan. Uh, so um, so we will go ahead and get started now with Africa. Now, what you have at the towards the end of the 19th century is industrialization only growing. The industrial production is only improving, and you have a lot more need for industrial goods. With this need, you also have the need for more natural resources. For the longest time, European countries could rely on colonies in the Western Hemisphere to provide them with these natural resources. But after the revolutions, after the upheavals in throughout the globe in the middle of the 19th century, you have a new world opening up for Europe. They can no longer really rely on trade with the Western Hemisphere, especially with the rise of the United States and the United States beginning to industrialize itself, taking all the natural resources from within the country, and also beginning to police what Latin America does as well. So the industrial needs of Europe are changing, and they need to find new places to fill these needs. And these needs are actually very important to modern society, because you have a lot of new industries growing within in Europe and even in the United States. The creation of steel really changes the urban landscape. You have this material that is stronger than iron but lighter than iron, and it's more durable, and better buildings could be created using steel. It is a mixture of carbon and iron, which means that you need a lot more of this carbon. You need a lot more coal. You need a lot more iron ore to keep up with demand. So you need to start finding places to get carbon and to get coal and iron as well. You have a lot of improved refining methods that basically create the steel industry, so it's cheaper and cheaper to manufacture, which means that there's a lot more profits to be made. And so when there's a lot more profits to be made, people are going to be wanting to make those profits, and so they're beginning to try to find more and more coal to create better steel. And with this, refined steel gives the rise of modern cities and modern skyscrapers. It is in New York City. I think this is the Flatiron Building in New York City that as one of the first of the skyscrapers here at was at about 10 stories tall, and pretty soon these early skyscrapers are going to be dwarfed in big cities. But it really changes the urban atmosphere of cities, because you're seeing people being pushed together, smushed together, basically, in more dense urban areas. And as the natural resources of the outlying areas are being used to create more and more industrial goods. So steel becomes very important, and the resources are needed for steel. You also have the rise of chemicals. And chemicals are used to better humanity, and chemicals, of course, need a lot of natural resources as well. You have a lot of use of chemicals begin to a lot of chemicals begin to be used in everyday life. You have soap now being manufactured on a mass scale instead of being done at home. Instead of using lye and fat to create your own soap at home, you can actually buy soap readily, and so people begin to bathe a lot more. People begin to be a lot more clean. Paper goods become more available as paper refining is improved, which means that you need to find a lot more trees. You need to find cut down some forests in order to create a lot more paper. But for businesses and for government and for record keeping, paper becomes much more important. And then finally, you get a lot better textiles and manufacturing. So you get a lot um, of improved clothing manufacturing. Clothes last a lot longer. Clothes are a lot brighter, a lot fancier. You can use a lot of different techniques to create fashionable clothing at an industrial rate, and so you need the natural resources for this as well. Um, and so you see here with the steel industry and the improved use of chemicals and textiles that you need a lot of natural resources. One of the things that really changes European society is the harnessing of electricity. um, this basically changes everything. At first, you need a lot of coal to drive turbine engines that use steam power to create it. But pretty soon, you have hydroelectric engines that create cheap power, basically using water to power these turbine engines that create cheap electricity for cities. And this is going to transform European cities as cities begin to turn to electric power. This actually creates nightlife. Before the harnessing of electricity, you did have a slight nightlife. I mean, it was dark and kind of dangerous often to go outside. So it wasn't something that you did on a regular basis. But once electricity is freely available, then you have an actual nightlife in cities. Cities begin to be 24-hour operations. And once cities are 24-hour operations, then so are factories. So factories, because there is a nightlife, there's also night work available. And you start seeing factories pump out, be working 24 hours a day, powering turbines are powering cities, and factories are pushing out manufactured goods day in and day out. So you need a lot more natural resources for that. And then finally, the biggest thing that needs a lot of natural resources is the automobile. The automobile industry begins to change, especially going into the beginning of the 20th century. After you begin to use petroleum for as the default um, method to power automobiles, and as petroleum refining improves, that pretty much goes hand in hand. Before gas was the default method to move automobiles, you actually had electric automobiles, steam powered automobiles, magnetic powered automobiles, hydroelectric powered automobiles. For basically from the early 1880s all the way into like the 1910s, you have much more of a um, of a diverse power source for cars. But then petroleum, basically because of the internal combustion engine, the way that works, petroleum becomes the key to power automobiles. And so you need to find places that have a lot of petroleum in order to get that sweet oil. And that's why you start seeing European forces begin to really look at certain places around the globe that have a lot of oil. And basically, at the very beginning, the rich are the only people that can really afford the automobile. They are the only ones that can afford a lot of these luxuries. But the automobile is actually going to become a a basic need for life pretty quickly. In today's society, I mean, most of us, if we were here, if we were meeting in person every week, would need an automobile to bring us into class, and so it's basically a necessity now. But at the very beginning, the automobile was basically there just for the very rich, and they were the ones that had the ability to use a lot of the different power sources, like I said, electricity, water, etc. But once it becomes much more of an everyday necessity, then that's why it sort of um, standardizes to use petroleum, and that's why everyone needs petroleum for their automobile. And so, along with these new industries, along with these new ways of living, you have a lot of new innovations that change the way the world operates. You have within the Industrial Revolution, you also have a transportation revolution. In the United States and in Europe, you have the creation of the railroad system, and the railroads have their beginning in Great Britain with the invention of the rocket, um, a steam powered machine that could use rails in order to move very easily. And after the invention of the rocket, throughout the world, you have over 900,000 miles of track laid down for the locomotive industry. And basically, the railroads become the default shipping and travel method throughout the globe. And pretty much outside of the United States, rail is still one of the most reliable and important travel and shipping methods. Here in the United States, we have gone to basically the automobile and um, and the highway system are the default shipping method for most goods. But in Europe, you could still ride trains throughout the entire continent. You can actually go from England to France by train, and in Asia, I mean, high speed rail is what connects a lot of Asian nations, and so. But in the United States, we kind of drifted away from that. But here in the 19th century, moving into the 20th century, basically the only way to get around, the only way to move things around effectively is through rail. Now, if you want to ship things and move things internationally, the way to do this is through steam powered ships. And this is where the United States is the forerunner, with the Clement in 1807 being the first of these steam powered ships that originally were moving through the Mississippi River and other river systems throughout the United States, then began to move into the Atlantic Ocean, moving back and forth. The advent of steamships makes sea travel faster and safer. And basically, by 1900, steamships rule the ocean. When sail and rowing ships are basically obsolete by the beginning of the 20th century, and only steam powered ships are out traveling through international waters, through the Atlantic, and even through the Pacific. So, with the improved transportation system, with the ability to move large amounts of goods and large amounts of people throughout the globe, you start seeing the need for resources grow among the countries, and the countries are more and more antagonistic towards one another. We looked last time when we talked about Europe, how there's continual wars between the nations throughout this time period as they continue to try to grab more land and grab more power throughout the globe, and there's throughout the continent, and then pretty soon they're going to move out throughout the globe, and there's going to be a lot more motivations to create these large multi-continental empires. Now, these new motivations for empire are led basically by economic forces, because, as I noted, with industry and demand for industrial goods only increasing in Europe, there was a huge need for raw materials. And then with the increase in nationalism, there's increased competition, and these are all the national rivalries really um, being brought forth. Being brought to the forefront, because these are countries that are fighting against one another, and now they're all looking for these natural resources in order to be more profitable. There's also technological forces that lead to imperialist motivations, especially when it comes to Africa. Uh, because defense is a lot easier with better guns and better weaponry. You don't have to have as many people stationed, or as many people there to watch over settlements if you have improved weaponry. Trade becomes a lot easier with the advent of steamships and rail travel, and then communications a lot easier with the advent of things like like the radio and telegraph wire, so that you can actually communicate within the continent a lot easier. You can move people and goods a lot easier with rail, and you can protect your interest with better weaponry, especially among people in Africa that didn't have the firepower that European forces had. So, um, Africa had long been this sort of dark continent that no one really no one in Europe really knew much about. It didn't really have any desire for, because as I noted when we first talked about Africa, there's a lot of rainforest, there's a lot of treacherous terrain, and there's a lot of disease. But with improved technology, with all these things, defense, trade, and communication improvements, you can actually move in for a lot further into the continent, and that is exactly what Europeans are going to do. So you have the economic forces, the technological forces, but then there's also social forces at work. Where we talked about social Darwinism last time, this idea that it is the strongest societies that defeat the weaker societies, and so moving into Africa, conquering these people just sort of proves this idea that Europeans are superior to other non-European forces. There's also the rise of Christian missionaries and the push for greater missionary work within Africa, and then moving eastwards into India and then into Asia. There is this need both from Protestant and Catholic forces to gain more souls. So you have nationalism mixing in here with religiosity. And there's finally something that we will dig deeper into in class, is white man's burden. White man's burden is this ideal that was sort of came up with by Rudyard Kipling of the Jungle Book fame, and basically it says that it is the white man's burden uh, to um, uh, to build up the savage. There's no way that Africans or any other non-white cultures are ever going to be as good as white cultures, but there is a way that you could at least make them not as savage. So basically forcing them to become much more European, and that's the forces that white man that is what is the white man's burden, is to build these peoples up. And so basically this cultural superiority, this idea that Europeans are culturally superior is really what's going to be this excuse for exploitation, sort of this idea that it is okay to exploit the Africans because of our social and cultural superiority. Had it just been the economic forces and the technological forces, there would have been at odds with the Enlightenment ideals, the beginning of sort of identifying with other peoples and seeing who is a human being. However, with things like social Darwinism and white man's burden, this sort of excuses the exploitation of Africa and Africans. So all these things working hand in hand, economy, or the economic forces, the technological forces, and this social superiority leads to the exploitation of Africa. And so we get to the exploits of Africa, of the Dark Continent, a continent that Europeans knew very little about and didn't really care about until they really needed natural resources. And as I noted earlier, that it was these new technologies that made Africa much more accessible. Africa has largely been unexplored by Europeans, but with the advent of rail, with better ways of moving people and goods in and out of Africa, it's a it becomes much less mysterious. The things that people had heard about in Africa was basically adventurers had gone in their military expeditions had gone into Africa, and so they brought back tales of their journey. So there was this sort of ideal of Africa being this place of lost empires and lots of treasure and adventures waiting to be had. And so, with this and the ability of people to move into Africa and work in Africa, you had a lot of people that wanted to go there for the adventure to try to make their way. Uh, um, and explore Africa. So the very first Europeans that are going in there are much more daring explorers, or a lot more of the upper class that are bringing in workers with them. But then once raw materials are found, such as gold and diamonds, then you start getting more and more of the working class being brought in to help African, basically slave class. Extract these materials. So the first people that go in are much more well-to-do adventurer types, and then afterwards you start getting the actual day-to-day working class coming in to get things like gold and diamonds, but then also industrial materials like ore, rubber, the and other industrial materials that are needed to power the factories. Europeans are going to slowly creep into to Africa and begin to set up colonies. You have things like Southern Rhodesia, which is actually built by actually sort of incorporated by Cecil Rhodes, who was the chairman of the De Beers Diamond Factory. As you can see, it is here is South Africa, and so it is modern day Zimbabwe, but this Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes, basically begins the exploitation of Africans for Africa for diamonds and other valuable materials, and Rhodesia will basically continue to be there until the 1960s, under the European control before they finally get their freedom. And then you have the Congo Free State, held by King Leopold, and we'll go a lot more into this one in class. But basically, King Leopold, not really affiliated with Belgium, but under his own power, he bought this country, and he basically exploited and mutilated hundreds of African workers in the quest for raw materials. So these two countries are some of the precursors to this creeping and exploitation into Africa. And this exploitation into Africa really um, uh, starts with the big two. It really starts with the British and the French. And British colonial Africa basically um, centered around Egypt and the Nile River. As you can see here, most of their holdings are going to be in this long strip of land. And British rule was a lot more indirect. They would come in, and they left the local elite as rulers. It was a lot of this indirect rule. They're basically there because of uh, the um, the size of England, and um, the way that England is the way that their colonial mindset was. They weren't about to put hundreds of soldiers, hundreds of local of European men in charge of these areas because they were completely outnumbered. Instead, they had the local elite continue their rule, and they would basically be in charge of them. But they kept the people inside, sort of this indirect rule. The French, however, here seen in blue here, were a lot more direct. They believed in civilizing the people that they conquered. They believed in assimilating the peoples of Africa and completely getting rid of their Africanness and bringing them more into French culture. So a lot of these nations here, French is still a major language that is spoken, but this leads to a lot of much more direct resistance by Africans as the French really begin to try to get them to quote unquote be civilized. Um, and so both this indirect rule and the French direct rule lead to this idea of high colonialism. Uh, Both the British and the French felt that the colonialism was this enterprise that was a moral and social responsibility. To the British, it was a responsibility to make sure that the people benefited in some way. The British, in many of um, their sort of excuses for colonialism, was that the people were benefiting from being um, directly catering to British people, and sort of being elevated. There's that white man's burden again, that the British were elevating them by having them at least understand British culture, and sort of by osmosis take some of this British culture within. And the French believed their social responsibility was to make Africans much more French. They would never be white Frenchmen, but at least they would not be, as they would say, as the savages that the French thought them to be. Um, so this high colonialism doesn't last very long throughout the continent, because the British and the French sort of have a lot of company pretty much afterwards. Here is in 1880 the way that Africa looks. Not a lot of uh, rule. By other countries. There's the Ottoman Empire. Algeria is French holding. Morocco and Cape Town down here are British, and you see some other little nations, but around 1880 you don't see as much. But man, by 1900, virtually all of the continent is under European rule. You have the British having control of all of these nations, the French here, as we noted before, but then also you have the Portuguese, the Spanish, the Italians, um, as well as the Belgians, as we'll discuss that more. So all of the entirety of Africa within 20 years has completely come under control of European powers. As you can see, this vast difference here by of who is in control of these areas. And so the way that Europe was able to get this control was that they really had this idea of the three C's, not the five C's like you have in Arizona, but the three C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. So basically, you are bringing Christianity to these people, you are creating commerce for these lands, and you are civilizing them. So these three C's are the excuses for the way that colonialism is used in Africa. And so the way that Europeans actually take over Africa, there are wars that are fought, especially in early exploration. But pretty soon afterwards, Otto von Bismarck is going to say, "Why don't we partition it up ourselves? Why don't we allow the stronger powers to take the most, but the rest of us will get a little piece?" You know, you have parts that are British, parts that are German, you know, the French, Portuguese, Italian. We're all going to get a piece of this cake. And by partitioning Africa instead of everybody fighting over it, you avoided, of course, avoided military conflict. You were able to trade pieces of the continent so that if you wanted to have areas that were much closer to what where your other holdings were, you could do that as well. Um, you could basically have these spheres of influence, as the British and French did, by having this long strip, or um, these areas that they controlled. You had much more of an influence among your colonial holdings. However, tensions are still going to persist among the conquered and the conquerors, and we're going to see what um, the what colonialism really does, what imperialism really does, and the reaction to colonialism and imperialism by Africans. So, colonialism pretty soon gives way to imperialism, as the colonies aren't really colonies as we would have seen previously. Previously, the colonies that European forces uh, um, would set up would be made mostly of the people of that country. So British colonies would be made up mostly of British expatriates and their descendants. Same as the French colonies would start with French people, and they would continue down the line. However, these new colonies that are being built up in Africa are still mainly African, or majority Africans with a minority ruling population. And pretty soon these colonies don't really um, give a lot of freedom to the Africans, and basically they become part of this imperial these new empires. The empires begin to basically exploit the people living there, and it's not really a colony anymore. It's just an imperial holding. And so, because of this, you have a lot of tensions between the conquered and the conquerors. For many of the people that say that it is a positive thing, that imperialism is a positive thing. They see it as a disagreeable but necessary phase in the evolution of a society. So, in other words, in order for societies to grow and move into the next phase, they have to be conquered by somebody and sort of absorb a lot of the positive forces of the quote unquote better society. Um, However, as those that are opposed to imperialism would state, that imperialism is a tragedy of major proportions. That moving even into the 20th century, that imperial holdings are so harsh on the Africans and the other non-white peoples throughout the globe that it really wasn't worth it after a while. And for me personally, what I think is that the fundamental weakness of colonialism is this, and the fundamental weakness of imperialism is this, that is ultimately based on the self-interest of the colonial powers. So the conquered had no real say in the way that we're treated. It was all up to the way that the conquerors felt. If they wanted to be benevolent, they would be benevolent. If they didn't, they wouldn't be benevolent. And so the Africans had no real say in the way that they were treated. They had no real agency in order to better themselves. They were only as good as they were allowed to be. They were only as successful as as they could under this oppressive system, and that's why you lead to a lot of these resistance movements. So there's several different African resistance movements, and we're going to look at a couple of them here. The most important one, especially into the 21st century, is the beginning of the militarism of Islam against the West. You have the beginning of the use of jihad, not just to being an internal struggle, it means more of an external war against the forces that are trying to conquer or eliminate Islam as they felt it. And so this is going to spread throughout northern Africa, the militarism of jihad, and as the northern African Muslim forces are going to push back in Egypt and in Algeria, especially fighting against European incursions. In the Sudan, you're going to have the rise of Muhammad Ahmad Abdullah, who calls himself the Mahdi, or the Redeemer of Islam. And Muhammad Ahmad Abdullah and the Mahdist forces are going to rebel against the British in the Sudan in 1885, capturing the capital of Khartoum and beheading the military leader, General George Gordon, and creating a new state. Um, you're going to have Herbert Kitchener coming in and eradicating the Mahdists by 1899. However, you're not going to actually eradicate the idea of the Ahmadists, as they are going to continue to push this hardline, very conservative Islam, very militaristic Islam that is going to really resound among the people that are being conquered and subjugated by European forces. In Ethiopia, you're going to have uh, movement where you see Italy invading, and the Ethiopians are actually going to defeat the Italian invaders, and then later on, the Ethiopians are going to ally with other European powers. And part of the reason for this is that Ethiopians are Christian. Ethiopia is a Christian nation, and they are sort of treated differently in this regard. And Russia is going to be one of the countries that Ethiopia allies with, and you're going to see Ethiopia remaining independent until the early 1930s, which we'll get to in a few weeks. The other um, area that I really want to look at is South Africa. 'Cause this is a very active place for resistance, and you'll see why. South Africa, the first resistance, really in towards European forces is by the Zulus, led by King Shaka. Shaka Zulu is a tribal leader that expands his kingdom and collides with the encroaching Portuguese, excuse me, not Portuguese, the Dutch, um, um, uh, the Dutch settlers within here. Shaka is going to fight against the Dutch and the British as well, and basically push the forces back until he's assassinated in 1828. And this resistance leads to a all-out war against the British in 1879. And in 1879, the Zulus will actually be finally be defeated because of superior firepower and a larger army of the British. So in South Africa, not only do you have a African resistance, but you also have resistance by settlers. The Boer War is um, a conflict that comes up because of British colonial uh, colonial attitudes towards even European settlers. Uh, the um, the Boer are Dutch colonists um, that have been living in what is now South Africa, but the Dutch are defeated by the British in 1806, and the Boer are told then that they are now British citizens, and they oppose British rule. And by the 1830s, you have the emancipation of slaves, and the Boer are very angry about this, and so they begin what is known as the Great Trek in the 1830s and 1840s, basically saying, well, if we can't have slaves here in South Africa, we're going to take our slaves and move up north. And they create two new nations. They create the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. And here's the Transvaal and the Orange Free State, and here is the province of the Cape Province, which is now South Africa. And so the Orange Free State and the Transvaal are neither recognized by the British, and so the British kind of leave them alone for a little while until the end of um, yeah, until the end of the 19th century, as more and more British colonists are coming in and are beginning to encroach onto Boer lands. Um, you start seeing the Boer beginning to fight back. Oops, I wanted to do that. And the Boer begin guerrilla tactics and sabotage, which leads to full scale war. Pretty soon, you have Kitchener coming back to quell the uprising. Kitchener, who we had already defeated the Mahdists in the Sudan. Herbert Kitchener is going to come in to quell the uprising, and here is where the British had learned from the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, the British were a lot more civilized, a lot more. Um, a lot more cautious of what they did. They didn't want to go into cities and immediately start arresting people. They allowed the American colonial rebels to sort of begin with guerrilla tactics, and they were able to hide within the cities in small villages, and basically stay one step ahead of the British until the French came in and helped the Americans defeat the British. But here, the British aren't going to allow the Dutch to do the same. There's a lot of ruthless tactics that the British use against the guerrillas. They're going to destroy whole villages. that they presume are being used to harbor rebels. They're going to place the Boer people in internment camps, and these are going to eventually become concentration camps. So you have the beginnings of the very first of these European concentration camps are held in South Africa, and they are terrible condition. The Dutch are sort of seen as lesser beings than British, and so they're not treated very well at all. And by destroying villages, by rounding up people and putting them in camps, they're able to quickly defeat the Boer, and you have the Boer become defeated in 1902, and by 1910, all of South Africa is a dominion of Great Britain. And so by 1910, you have all of Africa under European control in some way, and Europeans don't care if you're African, or even if you are uh, not African. They don't care if you're of European descent. European forces are going to begin to clamp down on the African peoples there, and begin to exploit all of Africa.